and welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode, I'll be discussing the 2021 slasher horror Fear Street Part 1, 1994, as directed by Leigh Janiak and as based on the book series of the same name by R.L. Stine. So, this movie actually forms part of a trilogy, with each movie, parts 1, 2 and 3, respectively being originally shot back to back and then released literally weeks apart. This being the first, introducing us to a new realm of terror, and with each instalment kind of focusing more on the legend and the legacy of an ancient curse bestowed upon a small town and community, if you like, called Shadyside, which has seen more than its fair share of seemingly unrelated massacres over the years. Set in 1994, we meet a group of teens from Shadyside, still reeling from the latest massacre, this time at their local shopping mall, who then get inadvertently mixed up into the curse one night following a rival football game with the neighbouring town of Sunnyvale, following which each of them are hunted by a murderously unstoppable force. Dina, as played by Kiana Madeira, along with her younger brother, Josh, as played by Benjamin Flores Jr., Dina and Dina's on-and-off girlfriend, Sam, as played by Olivia Scott Welch, and indeed a number of their friends must unravel this mystery that plagues Shadyside before they too are consumed by its vengeance. Now, the idea of an immediately available trilogy of films certainly did intrigue me. It certainly sounded like a unique idea for, a series of movies, but at the same time did have this kind of feeling of a TV serial, which, if I'm honest, did kind of put me off initially, which is why this review is happening some months after these films were released. So I did actually kind of put off, watching these on that basis, and kind of only really picked them up for something to kind of really fall asleep to, one night, just to kind of check it out. I am actually kind of glad I did. It actually ended up being quite an enjoyable movie for what it was, and knowing that it was kind of part of this larger piece, of a larger puzzle, in the end, it just kind of intrigued me even more. Needless to say that I didn't end up going to sleep at the time I thought I would that night. Once it was on, I was kind of hooked. As a horror, it's certainly it's a bit of a mix. The setting of 1994 certainly kind of adds a fairly nostalgic feel, and the cinematography kind of sets the mood. It sets it up a treat, from its kind of sweeping scenes to its stark contrast between the darker and almost neon bright tones. It's actually fairly effective, not always kind of paced too well, but in the end certainly came through with more than packed a punch, if you like, certainly delivering on the horror and the gore by the end. It starts off life as an outright slasher movie, quite the jolt in fact, but indeed trending on some very familiar territory. It then subdues for a while as we kind of set up the characters' backstories and emotional connections. At this point, it does kind of get quite difficult to see just exactly where this movie is headed. A number of other horror threads are kind of introduced and intertwined, is what I wanted to say. And for a while, they do seem at odds with this kind of whole slasher element that the film had going for it. Starting off life as kind of a Scream kind of craft hybrid, I think. It does eventually start to do its own thing. And from there, it does set forth its own law and its own rulebook for the universe that it creates. And that is when things start to get interesting. Now, I've not read the books on which this series is based, no surprise there, so I can't really comment on that. But for all intents and purposes, I have heard that they are pretty close to the source material. What I can say is that I am familiar with the works of R.L. Stine from my younger years, from his kind of early days with the likes of Point Horror and indeed the Goosebumps series. And indeed, this has certainly got his stamp running through it, from what I know of, kind of running through from the very, very beginning. Very much indicative of his style, but with perhaps a more adult twist than kind of his usual fare, shall we say. Well, from what I can remember, at any rate, it has been a long time since I read any of those books. The Point Horrors were fantastic, but it has been a long, long time. And indeed, that 90s style kind of actually worked for me on a number of levels. Initially, primarily being a slasher movie, it was very reminiscent of those kind of produced during the 90s, which did see the genre kind of have this new lease of life. Of course, with the release of the 1996 movie Scream. And the inevitable kind of slew of copycats which kind of followed, which brought the genre, of horror back into the mainstream. Not only that, both Point Horror and Goosebumps got into the stride in the 90s, with Steen producing many of his works during this era. So to kind of start the series here, it did seem to me to be quite a quirky and relevant idea that kind of added to the overall feel and atmosphere of this movie once you knew that kind of background. The movie has a very teen-orientated angle, as most teen slashers do, and indeed a kind of a fresh new cast, for the most part, which held up pretty well. It ends up having quite the mix of horror, dark comedy, teen drama, tons of angst, of course, and indeed its fair share of jump scares. Quite charged overall, and slightly raunchy. Definitely hits the teen slasher vibe, and towards the end has a fantastic energy that really does put you on the edge of your seat. It's not the most remarkable horror ever made, but it's certainly more competent than most. A slasher with an air of mystery that does kind of pull it through. It certainly has a very few, interesting developments along the way, and even a kind of a Scooby-Doo moment as our gang takes kind of matters into their own hands and looks to capture themselves a few axe-wielding foes, which was quite a fun addition, I must admit, and something a little bit different. They went kind of all out to kind of get through this mission. I also enjoyed the soundtrack, quite the 90s jukebox. It was brilliant, almost non-stop 90s hits. So if we didn't know we were in the 90s, the music certainly told us so, But it was a nice nod, back to the era too. And this was kind of complemented by a kind of very edgy and haunted score, co-penned by none other than Marco Beltrami of Scream, if you like, of the Scream series, and Marcus Trump. Overall, kind of having that very kind of familiar bass. So yeah, but incandescently eerie. Overall, this had a great atmosphere. I loved it and made quite a decent horror. Plenty of jump scares and quite an involved story when it got going. Some fairly well-rounded characters and indeed some pretty gory moments as it got going. This really felt like something I would have watched in the 90s, and I think that's what it was going for. With a contemporary take, but maybe, But it certainly captured the vibe of that era, and that was excellent. Certainly kind of getting creepier and more involved as the story unfolds. Perhaps kind of lulling at first, I must admit, but more than kind of picking up the pace and energy as we moved into that final act, and believe you me, it's worth it for that. The character certainly had some spunk and attitude, delivering the horror elements with a few tricks up its sleeve. Definitely having fun, kind of toying with the expectations of what we may kind of, considered the path of this movie to be about from that kind of intense opening sequence. In the end, I was glad it just didn't end up being another slasher movie, and I'm certainly intrigued to see what the other installments have to add to this story. So, it left me on that high. So, that brings me to the end of this episode. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions, and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you here at SciFirst MovieTalk, and definitely love to have you back. Most of all, just thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.